to the whole group here for inviting me. It is a huge honor, an honor to get this prize, an honor that is named after such an influential social scientist within a lab, named after, really one of the economists I look up to most, and who I was first introduced to in thinking about development and the development process as an undergraduate. So, thank you to Sir Arthur Lewis, and thank you to Hajnal, and thank you to the economists present here. Thanks everybody for coming. The background for this talk is that I, for a long time, did work on the political economy of universities, thinking about universities as more than just a producer of human capital, but as a political institution. And I separately did a lot of work on protests and protest movements. And in thinking over the past couple years about sort of the connections between my different research strands, a natural one was to think about the political economy of universities and how my thinking about universities as a political institution connected to my thinking about protest movements. And even a couple years ago, it was clear enough that there could be some connection. I mean, we all, I'll give you a bunch of historical cases that would have come to mind a couple years ago. If I were giving this talk, we'd talk about the free speech movement at UC Berkeley, we'd talk about anti-war movements, and so on. And so, I think you would have been interested in this even a couple of years ago. But let's get right to the point. Universities now are very much at the center of political action in the United States, and now, at this moment in this country and on this campus. More than centers of political action, they are really, a center of political attention. So this is Claudine Gay, along with the former president of UPenn and the president of MIT, Claudine being the former president of Harvard, speaking in front of Congress. And so, the focus on universities, is not something that just sort of, a student movement, but there's also obviously interest among, the governing class and among our legislators and governments more generally in what's going on in the university. Again, a couple of years ago, I might have added at this point, and I'll just briefly add now, but a huge amount of attention also played to university admissions practices. And so there was a major US Supreme Court case recently on affirmative action, and you can imagine that this is another dimension of the politics of universities, and I'll discuss that briefly in this talk as well. But just to say, this is a moment when politics seems centered on what's going on our campuses. And one thing I would say is that when I talk to people, definitely 10, 15 years ago, as I started working on like a political economy of universities, people would be surprised to think about a research agenda oriented around universities as important nodes of sort of political behavior and analysis. And perhaps many people are surprised in general at what happens on university campuses, and surprised today at what we're seeing with protest movements, including on this campus. And one thing I want to ask is should we be surprised? I'll try to say, no. I think that we can understand this process. Another question that comes up in the American media is whether what we're seeing is somehow something new, something kind of coordinated from like the ideological left, and maybe an ideological left that is somehow capturing a critical sort of theory-based curriculum and pushing what is described as like a woke agenda on campuses, and that this is something new. It might be something, again, that's sort of pushed by administration on university campuses, pushed by left-leaning faculty on university campuses. It might be something that's something novel and common to a new cohort of students. This is something that we can evaluate. Does this seem to be something new, something, in some ways idiosyncratic to our time and place? And finally, if there is something, sort of systematic and explicable in a way and coherent about what's happening politically on our campuses, both what we see among students, a mobilization and activism, and then coming on the other side from governing institutions and politicians, where is the coherence? Is there some relatively simple framework that can make sense of this? Where does it come from? So my argument in this talk is going to be that we can see something coherent in all of this sort of political activity centered around the university when we view the university not just as an economic institution producing education and human capital and productivity, although it is that, I'll talk about that, but I want us to think about it as a political institution. And it's a political institution in several senses that I'll talk about shortly. But the starting point is that it's an institution that connects to various social, economic, and political objectives that are kind of intertwined. There are these ties between the university and a range of objectives that a society might have, and those complex ties generate a politics, generate something to be contested. Actually, many things to be contested that are of deep importance, I would say, to our society. I'll illustrate these ties through a range of cases, going back in hundreds of years in history, and then with more of a focus today on important cases that illustrate these ties. And I think in a way what summarizes like much of what I'm going to say, although in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on one element of how these ties come together, is I'm going to highlight that universities have this crucial role in our society of training an elite, or training what I'll call a leadership class for our society. And as the focal institution that produces our leadership class, the university at some level is going to reflect our ideals as a society and our ideology. And that's going to play a key role in my thinking about the politics that we're observing today, as well as the politics that we observed historically. In creating this leadership class or this elite, universities are also naturally this institutional focal point of ideological transmission. And the concept that I'm going to talk about, some of these terms are subject to modification, and suggestions would be appreciated if they feel clumsy. But I'll talk about an ideological bundle that the leadership class leaves university with. That ideological bundle can be a toolkit in some ways, and those tools might be in some ways seen as apolitical: cost-benefit analysis, marginal thinking, counterfactual thinking, all tools that we as economists try to teach our students that I think are really effective and important ways to approach social, political, and economic problems. We want that to be part of this bundle that students leave university with. But students also leave universities with other elements of an ideological bundle, and some of those are much more normative, of course. And depending on who is coming into the university, what the university is producing in terms of a leadership class, which domains it wants to produce leaders for, the bundle will look different. And of course, over time and across institutions, the bundle is going to change and evolve and in many cases be challenged. We as faculty, of course, play a key role not only in transmitting an ideological bundle to students, but in creating the ideological bundle. That is in some ways the point of a research university, certainly, is to create new knowledge. And as we transmit that knowledge to the next cohort of leaders in our society, they aren't just passive recipients, they engage with us in a collegial environment. And you can think about the university as something of a crucible of ideological bundle creation and challenge and eventually transmission. So I'll talk about the historical implications of this process of creating a leadership class at the university, transmitting an ideological bundle, how that's changed, and what has arisen from changes in that transmission process in universities at different times. And then I'm going to close with a quantitative section describing, using new data, students' participation, leading and participating in social movements, primarily over the past 75 years or so. So the starting point for the talk is going to be presenting this sort of conceptual approach of thinking of the university as a political institution. Then I'll talk about a set of comparative cases from across space and time that illustrate the two elements of what a university is doing when it's creating a leadership class. Economists might think about it as selection and treatment. Universities select a group of people and then educate them. And both stages have a politics to them. And the politics of both of those elements will end up having implications that are economic and political. And one of the political implications, as we'll see, will be driving social movements and challenging the ideological bundle. Then I'll present this new data on social movements and student involvement over time, and then I'll close with some thoughts that I hope open the floor for discussion. So, conceptual approach. So the familiar starting point for thinking about universities as an economist, and this is almost something that I might have started to talk with, again, 10, 15 years ago, is that for a long time I felt like universities were thought of, sort of too narrowly as, an institution that produced human capital that would go into a macroeconomic production function. So what do universities do? Well, at the micro level, they produce returns. This is David Card's work. At the more aggregate level, they produce social returns, Moretti's work. Now, that might be thought of as shaping income levels across individuals or across space. Universities also change income levels at the society level by shaping innovation and productivity. And this is, again, super important. I'm not trying to diminish this at all. This is incredibly important work. But just to say, the economic starting point says, okay, universities shape the level of income, the distribution of income, growth of income. They also shape dynamics of social mobility. And in that sense, the economics of universities is something that I'll argue already implies a political economy. In the sense that if we just thought that the university had purely economic consequences, there would already be disputes and contestations over, well, what should universities that have these economic implications focus on? Given that all of the things that an individual or society might want to come out of the university, again, purely economically, may not be perfectly aligned. So if we care about maximizing innovation, what we might do is allocate our resources, allocate our human capital talent entirely to the top universities. That might generate the fastest rate of growth. On the other hand, we might have equity concerns regarding the distribution of opportunity, regarding the distribution of income. And that would lead to a different allocation of our university inputs. Even ideas that seem simple, like fairness, are not that simple when it comes to a political economy of universities' economic outcomes. Meritocracy, in quotes, is one approach to fairness, which is to have a single objective standard for admission. But to the extent that people have different opportunities to prepare for that one objective standard, that's not fair. It's not really meritocracy in some deep sense, and therefore we might have other fairness objectives. We might have objectives that are about enhancing access and expanding opportunity. And that might even be something we care about if we only care about innovation and growth potential, because if we don't include a wide range of individuals to provide human capital and creativity, then we're missing out on opportunities. We have other issues. You might have a society that cares a lot about reducing inequality, but reducing inequality might actually limit opportunities for social mobility. It's not obvious that those things are aligned. So, this is seen, among other places, in the acrimonious debates over college admissions. So even if we just think about the university as a source of variation in economic outcomes, that generates a political economy. And that can be very contentious by itself. Now, the truth is, universities aren't just producing economic outcomes. They produce political outcomes as well. That's been much less appreciated, among economists in particular, I should say. There are literatures in political science and in sociology that have highlighted some of these elements, but even so, I'm not sure that's been sort of systematically appreciated as it should. And some of them, we should have been thinking about this for a long time. So, to me, the role of the university and sort of elite education as a key input into our politics goes back to Plato. And this is not like an esoteric citation to Plato. I'm not qualified to give esoteric citations to Plato. This is the Republic. There's like the start of the Republic. As soon as Plato begins to talk about creating, some sort of ideal nation, he starts by talking about who will lead the nation. And he calls those people the guardians. And his starting point for the guardians, the very first thing he talks about is essentially selection and educational treatment. Exactly what we think about when we think about universities. Then we have found the desired natures, and now that we have found them, selection, how are they to be reared and educated? Is not this an inquiry which may be expected to throw light on the greater inquiry, which is our final end, how do justice and injustice grow up in states? So our selection and education of our leadership class, or our elite, is at the heart of how Plato thinks about essentially political economy. So what I want to say is this is something that in fact we have begun to document in economic history, and today universities have played a key role in producing the human capital that essentially runs our state institutions. And not just our state institutions, but also other sort of elite institutions, our corporations, our civil society organizations, our NGOs, and so on. So, there are examples at the very top. Think about Oxford producing prime ministers and so on. But more broadly, and I think the point is much broader than thinking about the very, very elite or the very top of a governing organization. What I have in mind is essentially in every domain in our society that has a sort of leadership or elite element to it, universities have long played a key role in molding the individuals that go on to serve in those roles. We have MBAs for corporate leadership. We have law degrees for legal, leadership eventually. We have MPPs and other degrees in public policy for eventual service in nonprofits and governmental organizations and so on. The university is qualifying people to enter this leadership class. And as such, the university, I would say, is a locus of elite creation, or the creation of a leadership class. There's a selection component, and universities have always devoted attention to the selection component, with different ideologies and different priorities taking different roles at different times and places. Sometimes heredity. The US still relies on legacy admissions. Sometimes a version of meritocracy, whether in the US or China, we see quite a bit of emphasis on that sort of value and system, and sometimes to pursue other objectives, political, social, and so on. The training of the elite, of course, is also crucial. Universities are providing this sort of bundle, and we could think about it as a methodological bundle, although I think many methodologies come with a sort of normative element to them. Certainly, more critically minded people would argue that, and I think there is some truth to that. You can't have a values-free social science, for example, and so there is this bundle of a leadership class ideology that's transmitted. Of course, it'll differ across leadership domains, and I'll come to that in a minute. So selection and training both will reflect the deep values of a society. How we choose our leadership class will reflect our deep values and our overarching ideology. That ideology, I'll be a bit vague about now. It might be a broad social ideology in the community. It might be the ideology of a ruling party. That will depend on context. But these deep values are reflected in the selection of our leadership class, and of course reflected in the way the leadership class is educated, what content they receive. And of course, given that this is the location where we're transmitting a set of values and ways of thinking to our future leaders, this is going to be a natural place for that ideological bundle to be engaged with. We engage with that ideological bundle as faculty all the time. That is our job at some level. And faculty have been more or less conservative over time and across space. Sometimes we've been forced to be more conservative by the threats of the church, for example. But we're always engaging with that ideological bundle. We are not passive when we transmit that ideological bundle, nor are the future leaders, the next cohort of the elite or the leadership class, passive recipients. And again, sometimes more passive, sometimes less passive, but we're human beings. We have the faculty to engage and to think for ourselves, and we do, and therefore this is going to be a space where these ideas are contested. And if they're going to be contested, well, one expression of that contestation is going to be protests and social movements. And there's every reason to think that any new cohort exposed to an ideological bundle from an incumbent is going to potentially challenge some elements of that incumbent ideology. It's a natural thing. So, why the university? Why don't we see this sort of challenge at Google or Goldman Sachs? I think there are some reasons, maybe a lot of reasons why we don't see it at Goldman Sachs. But at Google and other organizations that are large, full of an upcoming young elite, some of what I described before might continue to hold. But there are certain things about the university that sort of structurally are conducive to protest and social movements. So at the individual level, university students and the time of being a student, I think we're all aware of this, it's a time of sort of much greater freedom in many important ways. Up to age 18, we live under the roof of our parents, many of us, some people in a boarding school, probably even worse. And so there's a lot of monitoring up to age 18. There's also a lot of, full day classes, depending on where you are, especially if you're trying to enter the elite. We're talking about people in school for 8 hours a day and then sometimes studying for another 8 hours a day. So up to age 18, you're monitored and you're extremely busy. After university, you're at work. You need to make a living, you're monitored, you're extremely busy. University students have much less monitoring and a much lower opportunity cost of time. In addition, social movements and protests are fundamentally social activities. They rely on social networks, they rely on connections, and historically, and even today, even in the age of Facebook and Twitter, the density of students, the connections of students matter a lot for mobilizing people and coordinating people. It is fun to protest with your friends, and it's easier to coordinate on protesting with your friends and with your peers. And it's even easier when you're in a context where you have a whole bunch of organizations that are specifically oriented toward particular causes. Every university presumably has a club for social justice. That social justice club will interpret social justice in different ways for each cohort and take on different social justice causes for each cohort. And if this cohort says, my social justice cause is fighting for a ceasefire and fighting for Palestinian rights, that cause is there and theirs, and that social justice club exists already to mobilize its participants and get people to coordinate and turn out. So universities have this ecosystem that makes them natural places of coordination. Google and Goldman Sachs, I don't think, have like Social Justice Club and Freedom for Palestine Club and other clubs that are conducive to mobilizing people. Finally, university time is a moment and a context where we take ideas seriously. We as faculty should still take ideas very seriously. I think sometimes we do. Maybe sometimes we get more pragmatic or something as we age, I don't know. But I think we take ideas seriously, and I think we want our students to take ideas seriously. So when we talk to students about ideas, like social justice, and we talk to them about normative approaches to the world, again, we don't always, because if we're just training people to be scientists, we might not talk about normative issues at all. But in a university that's now training also social scientists and policymakers and lawyers, of course we're talking to them about normative questions. And if we're talking to them about normative ideas and ideals, then they're taking those ideals seriously at this moment, when working maybe a bit less so. So that's the structural reason why we get mobilization and costly protest activity. Now, there's also a time-varying component. The time-varying component involves the changing nature of the university, the changing process of producing a leadership class. In the Middle Ages, the leadership class that was being produced had 2 or 3, depending on how you classify things, roles. Primarily, university students were trained to serve in and eventually lead the church. University students were also trained to serve in administrations for lords, and combined with that, or related to that, to serve in legal administration, especially as Roman law spread around Europe and training in the Roman law became a typical pursuit of the university student. But that's essentially 3 jobs with a very narrow pool of individuals entering the university, and in fact a very narrow and tightly controlled curriculum. So this is an image of a historical painting of, or drawing of, university students studying the law in the Middle Ages, and the system was very simple. It was also very unidirectional. Individuals would study Justinian's code with a master reading the code and commenting on the code, and students engaging with that reading and commenting. And students would absorb Justinian's code, they would become Roman lawyers, and they would go off and join the leadership class, working for a secular lord, perhaps also studying canon law and working in the church. But this is, in some ways, a straightforward process of selection and ideological bundle transmission that isn't going to generate that much contestation and churning, you can imagine. I'll talk about some notable cases where that did happen, even in the early modern era. By the 1800s, universities changed. So this is Humboldt, who changed the nature of the university. Starting in Germany, the research university developed, and the point of a university was not simply to train people for these sort of social roles that established a sort of elite status on a group of people who were already quite elite, and prepare them for various roles, again, still in church and public administration and so on, but in fact to systematically produce knowledge, and especially knowledge that could be applied in ways that would support the economy and eventually support the state. The range of domains that universities were training people for, the range of jobs and ways of thinking expanded. And in addition, because the aims of the university expanded, not just to produce some noble looking public administrator or judge, but now also to produce really, really good science. The range of people who were brought into the university began to expand in a more meritocratic way. A broader pool of talent is recruited, and of course ideology also begins to change, which pushes in a direction of more inclusion, as more individualist individualistic, enlightened, humanistic types of norms evolve in the West, the range of individuals who are brought into the leadership class also expands. And so it's worth noting, I should say, that while much of my talk will be focused on what's happening on campus within the university as an institution, I should say, of course, broader social changes outside of the university are also incredibly important. So the rise of the Enlightenment, the rise of more liberal thinking over time is also a crucial complement to everything I'll be talking about here. In the 21st century, the university is, in so many ways, like, the opposite of what we had in the Middle Ages. The university explicitly now in the West is trying to draw a broader talent pool. It does so because that broader talent pool will allow more different people to contribute ideas, which is wonderful for growth and for scientific progress. It draws a broader talent pool because of ideological reasons. As more parties toward the left have increased their influence politically, as left-wing ideologies have expanded their influence socially, we now have universities that aren't trying to be actively racist, actively anti-Semitic, actively misogynistic, hopefully undoing some of those flaws of the past and expanding representation for ideological reasons as well as economic reasons. Now, the university is doing so many more things than it ever did, both in academic training and also in connection with society. And there's just two images that I think capture that a little bit. One is a picture from the University of Wisconsin of a woman engaging in a scientific experiment in a lab, and this is part of what the great research university does. Wisconsin being one of the world's best, also the university from my hometown, which I love. It produces absolutely world-class science, trying to draw in the best people from all over the world, and will transmit an ideological bundle that is oriented around scientific progress and discovery. Not to say that's the only thing Wisconsin does, but I'll give you an example from a different university that I also love and have a history with, Berkeley, just to give a sense of the scope of what universities are doing. This is an image from the Berkeley Law School website. Berkeley's Law School is engaged with community involvement that's aimed to apply the human capital within the law school to help underrepresented and maybe under-resourced individuals within the community. What does this reflect? Well, it reflects a particular aim of producing a certain type of leadership class. Berkeley Law wants to produce a cohort of lawyers who are socially engaged, socially, I would say, like sensitive and aware of inequalities and who help to address those inequalities. Why would we want to transmit that ideological bundle? Well, in addition to some moral reasons, a range of political reasons that involve making our society function better. If you're in the Bay Area, you realize like social and economic inequality is a massive problem. It's a huge challenge for politicians, for the governing class. So this is not to say that this is all like altruistic and intrinsically motivated. The governing class recognizes a challenge, and they are now adopting an ideological bundle that aims to address that challenge. Now, sometimes the governing class, the incumbents, will transmit bundles that are more liberal, and sometimes less so. And of course, the fact that Berkeley Law now has on its website, you probably can't read this, but it has a tab that's labeled racial justice. Presumably that tab didn't just come out of the blue out of some administrator's mind or some incumbent elite. To some extent it came from social churning and the demands that came from activism in Berkeley and elsewhere. Okay, so the university is a place that structurally is conducive to social movements. It's a place where ideas are taken seriously. It's a place where the creation of a leadership class has evolved, especially over the past over the past century, and especially I would say over the past 50 years or so, to become a more complicated place, I would say, to transmit the ideological bundle. It's complicated because the range of individuals being brought in are different, and different individuals, a wider range of people, will naturally have differing views on what the correct ideological bundle should be. And it's also made challenging by the fact that the leadership class being trained is just much broader. So we have a range of different leaders being trained, which also can lead to tensions within the university. And I think that creates an environment that naturally will lead to some political tensions and contestation. Okay, so some cases. So I'm going to split this in a way into the selection and the treatment. So in terms of the stakes of selection and the political importance that selection is given, and this is coming from the U.S., although there are similar issues that are raised elsewhere. Even in China, sort of a place where meritocracy and success on exams has been sort of a national cultural trait for centuries. There have recently been debates and even legislation around tutoring for these exams. And there have been restrictions on the ability to hire private tutors because the nature of meritocracy is so contested. So, but anyway, I'll talk about the US for now. We can talk about other cases in Q&A. So, I think this is, maybe widely known. I don't know how broadly known here, but there was intense debate, contestation over whether admissions to America's elite universities should allow for affirmative action, could be, must be race blind or could take race into account. And the arguments made on both sides were very much arguments made about fairness. One group of people said, of course, race should be taken into account. Race, has been a determining factor for many people's lives in very damaging ways throughout American history. Now it's time to try to undo that. Let's make race, something that we take seriously. On the other hand, taking race seriously can also generate, negative outcomes for groups of people like, Chinese Americans who are, immigrants who weren't direct beneficiaries from the exploitation of African Americans in the past and who now face disadvantage in college admissions. And so there are fairness arguments on both sides. This isn't something new. This is something that goes back, a century. So 100 years ago, so this is from a book review. So the book is called The Chosen, which I highly recommend, about sort of elite American colleges. And the review just has a quick discussion. By the 1930s, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and their peers arrived at a quite effective and yet subtle system for limiting the number of Jewish students. Essentially, the concern was meritocracy, in quotes, produced too many Jews. So, whereas the previous case was an attempt to use a focus on race to allow a disadvantaged group to enter, the leadership class. Here, a previously disadvantaged group is entering, and the incumbents want to keep them out. And so, how do you keep Jews out of universities when they're, highly successful, when they're working, hard and passing the exams? Well, you introduce like geographic diversity as a requirement. So there are a lot of Jews in, the Northeast at the time, in America's big cities. So now you make it a requirement that you have some sort of diversity. Not everybody can come, from Brooklyn or something like that. You need diversity. You also need to have a certain number of slots for athletic teams where Jews might be underrepresented and so on. This isn't just, a case of like, racial questions or questions about, inclusion in that sense. The politics of university selection are, at the heart of even sort of Communist Party politics. So after the Chinese Communist Party established the People's Republic, it changed university admissions. And again, this is a break from centuries of Chinese meritocratic tradition in education, and changed the basis of admission to class background, a very ideologically oriented admissions process. And so you see that the share of individuals, this is at China's second best, I would say, university, Tsinghua. People who went to Tsinghua might say number one, but either way, an elite Chinese university that sees the share of its students coming from peasant or worker backgrounds increase from 15% to nearly 50%. Over a 15-year period. So very ideologically driven change in admissions processes. Now, in 1977, the beginning of reforms, or the post-Mao era, sees again a shift in university admissions. I don't think it's an accident that this is one of the early reforms, and one of the reforms that people from that generation, I think, find most salient in China's social change at the time, from the Cultural Revolution, especially when universities were closed, in fact. China returns to a meritocratic exam-based system in 1977, and we might say, okay, this is great, it's meritocratic, it's fair, but what you see in the data on social mobility is that this is a graph of status persistence over, from across different birth cohorts, and you can see that status persistence gets very low among birth cohorts born around 1950 and lasting until about 1960. Now, birth cohorts born after 1960 suddenly have the meritocratic exam open to them again, and from the birth cohorts after 1960, we see status persistence increasing. So meritocracy is associated with less social mobility after 1977. And so, we can debate normative elements, but the point is a political choice to change admission processes had an impact on the very structure of Chinese society, social mobility, as well as entry into the elite. Entry into the elite via education is something that has had some of the highest stakes sort of impacts on Chinese history more generally. So Yingbai and Rui Shuijia have a really wonderful paper that highlights the fact that access to elite status, entry into this leadership class, is something that essentially can buy support for the incumbent elite. And this is something that they argue existed in Chinese society under the imperial exam system. So access through exams would lead to support for the imperial dynasty. Well, what happens if you take away the exams? Well, the exams were ended in the early 20th century, and they look at what that meant for revolutionary activity across spaces where there were more paths into the elite versus fewer. So some Chinese prefectures had relatively generous exam quotas. Those were places where the ladder into the elite was in some ways a more accessible ladder. It was a more meaningful ladder in those places than in other prefectures. And so what they propose is that when you take away a meaningful ladder into the elite, that is what can stimulate revolutionary activity, and this is exactly what they see. So on the y-axis, you have a measure of revolutionary activity, and you can see that prior to 1905, when the exams are abolished, you have no difference in revolutionary activity depending on whether your exam quota was generous or not generous. After 1905, places with more generous exam quotas see a sharp jump in revolutionary activity. So taking away this ladder into the elite leads to a rejection of the elite and effort toward revolution. So that's sort of on the selection side. On the treatment side, I have too many examples. I'll give you some examples here of the interest of the elite in educational content that clearly goes beyond mere economics. So one of the key elements of education in the Middle Ages was training in theology. As I said, leadership of the church was central to what the university did. And you can imagine that any sort of heresy, any threat to orthodoxy, specifically in the theological domain, would be of particular concern for the church. And the Pope, in fact, imposed a policy of only having theological teaching at the University of Paris, where the ideology, that ideological bundle, could remain tight and monitored. And in fact, there were several, essentially, purges of ideas throughout the Middle Ages, where in Paris there would be a decree that certain subjects were taboo. So the church controls theological education. Again, my favorite example. So for those of you who don't know, I've done quite a bit of work on Chinese political economy, some historical, some contemporary. So that's why many of my examples also come from China. I think it's also nice to see many of these ideas outside of the West as much as possible. So, one of the key sort of political questions and cultural questions in 19th century China was how much Western educational content to adopt. And there was very clearly a concern that adopting too much Western education, while it might be technologically productive and militarily valuable, could be culturally and politically damaging. So there's this great quote from this official, Zhang Zhidong, who says, if one wants to strengthen China and preserve Chinese learning, one must study Western learning. Yet if someone studies Western learning without first firmly being rooted in Chinese learning to cultivate his character, he may become a rebel leader if he has a strong body and a slave to the West if he is weak. So I think a very powerful statement about what this ideological bundle must look like if we want to produce the leadership class that is desired. Germany in the Third Reich, of course, is obsessed with not only what is taught, but who is teaching, and in an example of probably the greatest self-inflicted wound in terms of lost human capital, dismissed many of its Jewish scientists because they were seen as politically unreliable, and of course you could argue that dismissal was at the root of many of their technological failures, and certainly also at the root of many of the United States and the West's technological and scientific successes later on. But along with all of the obvious horrors of the persecution of Jews in Germany and Europe during World War II under the Third Reich, this dismissal of Germany's most talented and most influential scientists is, to me, a clear example of prioritizing a cultural and political narrative around education rather than a productivity narrative or an economic one. The US Congress, of course, remains obsessed with what's going on within our schools today. I mean, US governors as well, Ron DeSantis famously in Florida, and in general, there is a huge amount of discussion over the content of curriculum. So what are some of the consequences? Again, and I could give you more examples that we have time for, but universities have been at the center of historical political contestation of the ideological bundle and more generally, social and political debates across history. So again, I want to go back to as many interesting cases as possible. One of the first major sort of ideological questions that came up within the university regarding the papal schism. So in 1378, 2 popes were elected in Rome. One took his seat in Avignon, where popes had previously spent much of the previous century, and one took a seat in Rome. And Europe was split over allegiance between these 2 popes. I mean, you can imagine this is an extraordinarily high stakes discussion over what should the ideological bundle contain. Should it contain allegiance to a pope in Rome or a pope in Avignon? And it's not just our education that depends on this or an exam score. It's whether your soul will burn in eternity or not. High stakes. So these discussions are centered in the University of Paris. The University of Paris convenes a range of different discussions. It tries to organize different mediation arrangements, different conclaves to try to resolve this incredibly high stakes ideological dispute. When the University of Paris decides it can no longer transmit its ideological bundle to the full range of students, it kicks out its German, Holy Roman Empire, students and faculty. So Germany, the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, had no universities prior to the Papal Schism. After Paris kicks out German university students and faculty, new universities are established in Germany, and this has enormous implications for the development of human capital, and my co-author Daphne Cantoni and I argue the development of legal institutions in Germany. As more university-trained individuals arise in the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, one sees legal institutions develop with consequences for economic activity. The Reformation, of course, was another cataclysmic event for Western Europe, I mean, in so many ways. And much of its intellectual discussion and debate and contestation occurred in universities. Many of its consequences also can be seen in universities, where we see students changing their fields of study and shifting towards secular study and paths into secular administration away from church work. The Chinese Revolution of 1911 is an event that has its roots in universities, it's been argued, in Japan. In Japan, one had many Chinese students who were studying abroad. It was in these Japanese universities that nationalist and somewhat and Republican societies were organized and coordinated. When these students came back to China, they played a key role in the revolution. at a more mundane level, but also to just illustrate that the details matter. When we look at the functioning of American courts today, the teaching of an element, again, that I would almost think of as like a methodological element of the ideological bundle. Do we teach a law and economics approach to our incoming cohort of legally trained leaders, our future judges and lawyers? It turns out that studying law and economics, studying with law and economics faculty, generates changes in how judges behave later in their careers. Okay, the big one now. Finally, I get to the point. Universities have regularly produced social movements of great importance. How are we on time?
10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll go through this. This is what you're waiting for. I'll give you the full range of cases, and we can discuss them afterward. So universities have been the site of the major social movements, certainly in the United States, over the past 3/4 of a century. And unsurprisingly, I think, many of these sites will look familiar. This is the same site that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, Colombia and its anti-war protests. I could show you Colombia, just keep that the constant throughout. In fact, that might be interesting, but because Colombia is central to protest movements across a range of different movements in history, but I'll give you some others. Free speech on Berkeley's campus. When we think about changes also in how we think about economic policy and economic justice. So these are two different workers' rights movements, one in Berkeley for workers' rights abroad, so the anti-sweatshop movement, centered around American college campuses. The living wage movement, there's a major protest I remember when I was younger at Harvard that captured public attention. Democratic movements, of course, we could talk about these, not always successful, as in the tragic case of Tiananmen Square, but sometimes successful, as in the case of Prague, and a range more recently of divestment movements. And I want to think about these as almost like a sequence of events. We first asked for divestment from those people on the left. Although I must admit I was not as radical and active as maybe I think I should have been in college, but I was also in a small liberal arts college. It might have been different had I been in a bigger urban environment. But anyway, I think many people of a liberal mindset would say, what a wonderful thing to have pressured South Africa to abandon apartheid. Well, at some point, that was a very radical group of people who were arrested for calling for divestment. Today, whether we think, the right policy is exactly like, let's divest from BP, divest from all fossil fuel producing companies, or try to work on sort of green, sustainable practices, in other ways, I think all of us have now adopted into our ideological bundle a concern for the environment and sustainability. I'm pretty sure that's true. And what seemed incredibly radical at the time, like a focus on like pressuring American companies especially to become more sustainability focused, now that doesn't seem radical, it seems obvious. And finally, let me close by being a bit provocative, we have pressure to divest from Israel. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that the obviously right thing to do is to oppose the existence of Israel. That's not the necessary implication of these movements being successful. But each of these protest movements was the legitimate and deeply engaged and concerned expression of a group of young people calling for a change to the ideological bundle. And it's changed in different ways. I don't think it's the case that all universities have divested from BP, but they all have adopted, and I think broader society adopted as part of the ideological bundle, concern for the environment. Similarly, I will say, and I think we're already seeing evidence of it, so my punchline may not be that provocative anymore, but these protests for a ceasefire will be successful. They aren't going to be successful necessarily in achieving a specific policy, but they will be successful in enforcing the ideological bundle, I believe, to evolve. Now, what it evolves toward, or where it converges, where that ends, I'm not sure. But my personal take is that the ideological bundle, to me, my politics. I don't know how clear they are, but you know, I'm not, you know, such a radical, but probably people would place me, you know, toward, you know, the center left, let's say. I think many people like me, many people who are protesting around the world, many students who are protesting, at the very least see a problem in allowing any sort of Israeli action in Gaza to go forward without question, without qualification, without monitoring and scrutiny and criticism. And so, you know, is it such a big change to the ideological bundle to say, well, you know, Israeli policies need scrutiny? And in fact, it can be acceptable to question what Israel does. In fact, many Israelis question what Israel does. So, you know, for the ideological bundle among the Western elites to incorporate, we are willing to question Israel, you know, I don't think that would be such a big deviation in the ideological bundle. I think it's already happening, in fact. Therefore, my punchline isn't very provocative, but I think the ideological bundle will be changed by these protests. And I think that is the outcome of really well-meaning social engagement. And I think it's in all likelihood the very moral and correct outcome that will look to us to be moral and correct, just like the first two panels. Okay, that's my provocative statement. Maybe. I don't know how provocative it is. But let me show you patterns from data, just to give you a sense. Okay, what we can see in data that again make this point that this is something coherent. There is something systematic about students engaging in politics and social movement. So what I'm going to do is show you quantification of existing sources that haven't been quantified before. So one is the Swarthmore Global Nonviolent Action Database. It covers events you know, all the way from 18th century BC, but we focus on 65 years from 1950. It focuses on sustained movements and sustained political activity, and it's collected in a way that might be, you know, biased in some sense. It's more oriented around the U.S. It's coded by Swarthmore students primarily, but it's not biased in any sense toward student movements. It's a global nonviolent movement database. We code student participation in two ways. One is relying on the coding of the database itself, and one based on our own coding. And I should say, this is work with a wonderful LSE master's student named Hajnal Lecture, and she and I are working together on this quantitative part, which is great. And I'll put in a plug for her. She's a wonderful sort of emerging young economist. Let me then mention two more databases, Mapping American Social Movements. You can tell this is focused on American movements. What's great about this is that they really have granular events, so I'll show you counts of specific events, and we go through those events and identify the participation of students. Finally, this mass mobilization data project explicitly doesn't include the US, so it's nice to see what an international database looks like, and we search for keywords to code student involvement. So here's what the Swarthmore Nonviolent Action Database shows from 1950 to present: total protests and the student share. In red, using their coding of sort of student leadership, in blue, hours. What you can see is that, you know, it's not the case that 100% of social movements had student involvement, but a really substantial share. You know, in some cases, in the early 60s, you know, a very high share. In more recent years, a more modest share, but a substantial share of social movements that they code had substantial student involvement. This student involvement exists across domains. It's not the case that students are just interested in a set of like student issues. University students are engaged with the ideological bundle, I would argue. They care about issues of democracy, economic justice, the environment. It's a broad range of issues that students have engaged with, and interestingly, it's a set of issues that changes over time, which looks to me like new cohorts engaging with new pressing issues that challenge them or then force them to contest the ideological bundle. So initially you see a spike in student protests engaged in the civil rights movement. Then you see a spike in the anti-apartheid movement, the divestment movement. Then you see a little bit of democracy. Then you see later on fossil fuel divestment, anti-sweatshops, and living wages. And so each cohort of an emerging leadership class engages with its issues and challenges the ideological bundle to change. You can see in this graph that these are the universities that are producing a leadership class that are most involved. So they're the flagship state universities and the elite privates in the United States. Berkeley, of course, gets number one. Although people claim that Berkeley's become much less active in recent decades. Data from an alternative source, this Mapping American Social Movements project, also shows substantial student engagement. This is focused on the anti-war movement. And anti-war protests had a really substantial share of protests that included student involvement. Of course, we can think of cases where student movements and universities are central to protests abroad. The White Rose movement in Nazi Germany was organized in Munich. The 1968 protests were concentrated around universities. The Velvet Revolution, Tiananmen Square, and more recently in Iran. We don't see the same share of protests. There's divided autocracies, weak democracies, and mature democracies. But we see is a good 15% of protest events, whether in a democracy or a non-democracy, involve students. And students, again, aren't the majority, aren't present in the majority of events, but a substantial share abroad as well. So let me conclude. So what I want to say is that university students have played and continue to play an important role in driving social and political change. I think they've changed our ideological bundle in important ways, in ways that we currently value, in fact. This isn't recent, it's not localized to the US, it's not some new ideology that's captured universities. It's not some faculty conspiracy or anything like that. Each generation is pushing back against the ideological bundle that it's asked to take on. And the bigger the wedge between the young and the old, the bigger the potential for contestation. And it might be the case that the broader social change is playing a role. As I said, this isn't all about what's happening inside the university, it interacts with what's happening outside as well. Now, I think one thing that's really important to note, and I think this is a comment that I would make to the protesters as well, is that this type of contestation, I think, really relies on the university remaining a collegial and liberal institution. I think what that means is that all of us, stakeholders in the university, want to create this environment for contestation. But that contestation needs to respect essentially the other members of the community, human dignity, human rights. People shouldn't be threatened with violence. I hope that goes without saying. And this type of contestation works when the university remains liberal and open and respectful of community members and community norms. I think as long as we do that, these types of contestations are super productive. And again, they rely on the university being what it is. It would be a really terrible thing if that were to change on either side. If university administrators begin to make the university illiberal with surveillance, with police violence and threats and so on, or if protesters make the university illiberal by generating a feeling of fear or threat. So this is super important. I think if we maintain the university as a liberal institution, this type of contestation and the rise of social movements is a natural outcome of the way we are currently selecting our leadership class and the way we're training it. And it's up to us to decide, is this the institution that we want? Is this the type of leadership class that we want? And we can debate different elements. I think the point is that the types of leaders that we're producing and the types of debates and contestation and challenges that we experience are deeply linked. They're part of this nexus, this locus of the university as this training ground for our leadership class. Thank you. That's all I have to say.